Well, welcome into episode 4 of Finding Hope in Your Marriage. The title of this episode is Fighting Fair in Marriage. And there's really something to that title because, listen, conflict is inevitable in marriage. Conflict is inevitable in life, and particularly in marriage when you live that closely with someone. I always say this, conflict is not the problem. Unresolved conflict is the problem. And so in this episode, we want to talk through how to resolve the conflict in our marriage. And to do that, I want to walk us through intimacy in marriage. Now, we've got a whole episode on intimacy in marriage. Jason and Amy Archuleta did a great job walking us through that. But let me remind us of the 3 different ways we find intimacy in marriage. Okay, so in marriage, there's obviously, and this is usually what we refer to when we're talking about intimacy, is there's a physical intimacy, right, that's shared between husband and wife. But there's also an emotional intimacy. And by the way, you can't have true physical intimacy without emotional intimacy, and also without spiritual intimacy. And so there's these different levels, or not even really levels, but different aspects of intimacy in marriage. And because these are the places where we find intimacy in marriage, these are also the places where we can find conflict in marriage. We can find conflict in our spiritual intimacy. We can find conflict in our physical intimacy. We can find conflict in our emotional intimacy. And most likely, conflict is not isolated to one of these areas, but to all 3 of these areas. Even if we don't necessarily think it's involving all 3 of these areas, more than likely it is. In fact, I would challenge you right now, if there's a conflict or an unresolved conflict in your marriage somewhere, ask yourself, is it just in one of these areas? Or dig deeper and find, is it in all 3 of these areas? And here's what happens. It's because in these areas, there are 4 different levels of communication. Now, we've talked about, we've had an episode on communication in marriage as well. But let me kind of try to tie all of this together, okay? So when we're talking about communication, the most basic level of communication we call facts, right? Facts. So right now, as I'm recording this episode, I can tell you it's 84 degrees outside. That's a fact. It can't really be debated with, okay? Or I can tell you that today I'm recording this episode on August 11th, 2021. That's a fact. It can't be argued against. It's a fact. It's the most basic level of communication. Beyond that level of communication, we go to what we call opinions. Now, opinions can be debated. So I can say, I really love the hot temperatures of summer. Or I can say, the hot temperatures of summer are the best temperatures of the year. You can debate that statement because that's an opinion. So in our marriages, we get to the place where we talk about facts. We get to the place where we talk about opinions. And then we move beyond opinions to feelings. Think back when you first began to date your now spouse and how you worked through these levels of communication. You on your first date, you probably spent a lot of time talking about facts and opinions and maybe even got into some feelings. And the more and more you grew closer together, the more you talked at the feelings level and less at the facts level. And then finally, we get to the top level of communication, which we'll call transparency. Transparency. If I misspelled that incorrectly, you know what I'm talking about, right? So you have facts, opinions, feelings, and vulnerability. Transparency. In our places of physical, emotional, and spiritual intimacy, we work through these levels of communication. It's very difficult to have conflict at this level of communication. It's much easier to have conflict at these levels of communication. And here's where the problem comes in a lot of the times. In our marriages, if one of the partners begins to share at a deeper level, especially a level of feeling or transparency, and they're responded to or they're met at a level of facts or even opinions, the potential for conflict increases. So when we were dating and not yet married, we spent a lot more time at the upper levels of communication. It's just natural that the longer we live together, the longer we're married, it becomes more essential or more easy to spend time at these levels and less time here. So my wife, Amy, and I, we've been married 28 years. We have 2 boys. One's 23, one is now 19. We are now empty nesters. This is brand new for us. But what we discovered that happened throughout the season of our marriage is dating, we spent a lot of time here. Early married, we spent a lot of time here. As we began to have kids and life got crazy and chaotic and hectic and busy, we tended to spend a lot of time here, a little bit of time here, and very little time here, because our day-to-day communication was, who's picking up this one? Who's taking this one there? Who's responsible for delivering this or getting this, or an opinion about those facts, and every once in a while a feeling about, man, I'm really exhausted because of this, or I don't think you're helping enough here because of this, and very little or more little of this. And so it's a constant struggle to get to this level. And because that becomes a constant struggle, if one partner begins to share here and they're met at a level here, there's a great deal of conflict that can exist. Okay, so hang with me. I want to switch from triangle to a circle, okay? So, if we now have a circle, we have 2 different directions to go when we look at conflict. If we have a conflict, okay, that's come from that level of communication or anywhere else in our marriage, we can go one of 2 directions. If we go this direction, we come into a cycle of hurt. And oftentimes, through the conflict, when we come into a level of hurt, we refuse to have conversation about the hurt because maybe we've gone to a level of feelings or transparency and we've been met in response with a fact or an opinion. And if that happens enough times in our marriage, in our communication, then the likelihood that we want to go through a level of feeling or transparency to explain our hurt or describe our hurt diminishes, because we don't want to be hurt again and being responded to from that level. And so because of that, then we move into a place of bitterness and resentment. And when enough bitterness and resentment builds, we can run into major issues, conflict in our marriages, unresolved conflict. But there's another way to go. We can go this way. And when we go this way, instead of hurt, we talk about heart. And when we talk about heart, we make a commitment in our marriages to have those important conversations that we need to have. And to realize that when our partner opens up to us from a level of a feeling or transparency, that we need to respond from a level of feeling and transparency as well, instead of responding from a level of fact or opinion. And even though these conversations are sometimes very difficult and very hard to have, they're important to have at a heart level, and to take the time to have these conversations at a heart level. And if we have these conversations at a heart level, then instead of moving into a place of bitterness and resentment, we move into a place of forgiveness and healing. It's impossible to have a beautiful marriage without learning the concept of forgiveness. It's impossible to have a beautiful marriage without having heart-to-heart conversations when times of conflict come up. And so each time a conflict comes up, we have a choice to make. We can move into a hurt or we can move into a heart. And both of us have to move into this together. And sometimes that's the conflict in and of itself, is having a conversation of how we often move into this, or one of us moves here and one of us moves here, and how we both move into the heart conversation, which leads to forgiveness and healing. Now I know I can put a circle up here and this looks very easy, and it's much easier here than it is in reality. But my challenge to us as husband and wife is to work in our marriage to move our conflict to the places of heart and forgiveness and healing, and away from hurt and bitterness and resentment. So maybe you're in a place of conflict in your marriage right now. Would you take some time? Husbands, take the lead. Take some time, sit down, move to the heart, find forgiveness and healing, and move away from the hurt and the bitterness